Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.
You can't understand Luke 15 if you don't understand Luke 14. They're linked. They're joined at the hip. And if you look in Luke 14, it starts out like this. It happened when he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees. Okay, not just a Pharisee, but one of the leaders of the Pharisees. One of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath, no less, to eat bread. They were watching him closely. So, I want you to get this picture, okay? Jesus is out of his element. He doesn't usually eat with folks that drive the kind of cars or maybe the kind of camels that these guys drove, right? With all those German symbols on the front. He doesn't do this. It's not who he hangs out with. He's invited over to Richie Rich's house, and it's a beautiful ornate table with the dining room, and everything looks beautiful. And this Jesus is out of his element. As the story goes along, it turns out somebody sneaks in to the banquet. Somebody that was not invited, somebody that was not supposed to be there for Sabbath lunch. They never would have been invited. And this person has what some of your Bibles call as pleurisy. They had abnormal swelling, like some of us are feeling in our bellies after all these meals. There was something really wrong with him. And in that culture and in that time, if there was something really wrong with you physically, then somehow God was upset at you. You weren't pleasing to him, and he'd either cursed you or let the devil curse you or something. But you weren't right with the Lord, and if you had something wrong with you, you had no place in a house like this, especially for this kind of a meal. And Jesus looks around, and he says, "So, is it cool to heal this guy on the Sabbath or not?" Everybody's looking at each other. Oh, don't say anything. Oh. They're silent. And Jesus heals the man that doesn't belong. Heals him right there. I don't know. It would have been cool to see. I wonder if like you could see all the deformities and the swelling, and if he just touched him and the guy went back down to normal, and oh, I'm gonna go home, you know. And the Bible says, and he left, because he wasn't invited. He wasn't a guest there. This creates some tension in the room. And Jesus goes on in verse 7. And he says, and he began speaking in a parable to the invited guests when he noticed that they had been picking out the places of honor at the table. Remember, this is somebody of notoriety. This is a leader of the Pharisees. When you're invited by someone into a wedding feast, don't take the place of honor. For someone more distinguished than you might show up, and they might, you might get moved. And that would be embarrassing. Verse 10, he says, "But when you're invited, go and recline at the last place, at the very last place on the table, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher,' and then you'll have honor in the sight of all that are at the table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." And that's a theme of Jesus, especially in the book of Luke. And then when he went on to say, and this just really got underneath them, because remember, the people sitting around this table, they all had some in with the leader of the Pharisees. So they were the right people at the right spot, and man, they loved it there. And Jesus, again, out of his element. He says, when you have Sabbath dinner, starting in verse 12, when you have a banquet like this, don't just invite your friends. He says, invite people that you don't want here. He says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they might give you some sort of a repayment and invite you back. When you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and then you'll be blessed, since they don't have the means to repay you. For my last church, not the one that I'm in now, my last church, we had potluck every single Sabbath. Every single Sabbath we had potluck. And somehow, someone in town got wind of this. And every single Sabbath, there were 5 or 6 people off the street that would show up. They wouldn't go to Sabbath school. They wouldn't go to church. They would show up and they would sit and in the potluck room while everybody was preparing the food, while the church service was going on. They had no interest in the church service. They just wanted some good vegetarian fare, right? They wanted some good food. And so I saw them there, and I got to know them by name and stuff like that. And I'm telling you, it was really uncomfortable. They were a little bit derelict, and they were, there was some stuff wrong. And but I got to know their names and everything. And after church, after potluck, we were all cleaning up, and they'd been long gone, hopped on the bus and drove off. I had a circle of people that were in charge of the potlucks around me. We don't feel comfortable with those people being here. I said, you don't? No, they're obnoxious, they're rude. One of them smells horrible. I said, yeah. And they said, and as soon as we have prayer, they're the first ones up to the table to get the food. That's rude. They don't even come to church. They don't contribute anything. They said, we feel really, really uncomfortable with this. I said, I think you might have a point. So let's talk about this. But let's talk about it tomorrow night in my office, Sunday night, 7 o'clock. Can y'all be there? Yeah, we can all be there. I said, read Luke 14, and then come and let's talk about this. Nobody showed up to the meeting. Verse 16, but he said to him, a man was giving a big dinner, and Jesus goes and tells another parable after somebody blurts something out in the meeting trying to get attention. And he invited many, and you know this, right? And he invites all of the people you're supposed to invite, and none of them want to come. They all have excuses, right? I just got married, I'm washing the camel, and I can't come today, and I got to do this, and I got to do that. Nobody comes to the banquet. And so the master of the banquet says, well, just go invite everybody. Forget about the invited guests. And they go invite everybody, and some people come in, but there's still a whole bunch of chairs left. And then Jesus says, go out into the highways and into the byways and invite everybody. And in Matthew's version of this parable, he says something incredibly, incredibly awkward. The master says, go invite everybody, the righteous and the wicked. I want them filling this hall up. I want everybody around my table. Well, now, these people, are getting hot under the neck. Jesus is saying, he completely ruined the soy loaf that they had, So Jesus in Luke 14 tells them, this is who you should be dining with. You're leaving all the important people out. You think you're important, but all the important people are the ones that you should be inviting, and you're not inviting them. The very next chapter, Luke 15, starts out like this. The scribes and Pharisees were grumbling about the kind of people that Jesus was dining with. This is how it starts. The very next, they're grumbling about the kind of people Jesus is dining with. They're grumbling that he's dining with tax collectors, and we all know about them, right? You've been in church long enough to know about tax collectors. And sinners. And that word sinners is directly inferring people who have sexual sin in their life. Prostitutes and the like. People who commit sexual sins. He's eating with these people. And Jesus catches wind of their grumbling. And to answer them, he says, let me tell you 3 stories. And you know the stories, right? Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. Lost sheep, interestingly enough, we always see the picture of the nice-looking Jesus picture where he's got his head cocked like this, and he's got a little lamb around his shoulders, and he's smiling. That's a really bad misrepresentation of what this is talking about. Because that sheep, that word is not little tiny lamb. This is a full-grown sheep. And in that culture, some idiot sheep would have went wandering way off, and the shepherd would have had to put some guys in charge of the other ones, and he would have had to go find him. And if he's going to carry him, the burden of this big beast on his shoulders would have been tremendous. Sweat and agony trying to get this sheep through the crags and rocks. There have been a couple of really cool carvings of this, how it would have really looked, and how people in the Middle East would see this. A big old lug of a thing on this guy's shoulders, and he's really bearing a burden rescuing this sheep. Lost coin, you know that. And then he gets the parable of the prodigal son. And I want to tell you this parable as it would have happened for real in the Middle East. So Jesus says there was a young man who was dissatisfied with whatever was going on in the house. He didn't like his dad's rules. He didn't like any of this. And he goes to his dad and he says, listen, I want out. I want my share of the inheritance. When are you supposed to get your inheritance? After somebody dies, right? So basically he's saying, listen, you're dead to me. I want my inheritance. The response should have been the master clapping his hands together, servants coming in, beat the snot out of this little kid, throw him in a closet until he learns his lesson. Okay? What most of us would have done if our kids would have. Right? You want your inheritance? I'll give you your inheritance. Be tasting leather for the next 2 weeks. But instead, raising the blood pressure of the Pharisees that are listening to him, the dad says, okay. Now, we picture in our mind that the father goes into his bedroom safe and opens it up and gets a couple of bags of gold and goes, here you go, son. But that's not how it went in that society. In that society, if you were rich enough to have that kind of inheritance, to give that kind of money to a kid, that meant that you were a part of a town and you were central to its economy. The father had to ruin the economy of the town to give his son what he wanted. It didn't just disrupt the father's life. It didn't just disrupt the other son's life. It disrupted the life of everybody in that village. Everybody was affected by this snot-nosed little brat. So he liquidates, he gives it to the son, would have taken some time, and then the son goes off what we know is called the far country. So being around Galilee where Jesus was telling this parable, the far country wasn't that far. It was just on the other side of the lake where they had pigs, where the demon-possessed man was. Remember, he was healed, the demons went into the pigs. It was just right there in the Decapolis, just right around the lake. But he goes off to the far country, which would have been very far from the traditions of his people, and he wastes all his money. And we don't know at this point what he wastes his money on. It's just gone. We know that. A famine, which happens in that part of the world, comes in, and the kid is destitute and he's poor, right? And he ends up in the pig pen, and he just longs to eat what the pigs are eating. And the Bible says he comes to his senses. Okay, he understands. He says, I'm just going to go ask my dad for a job. He's not going to take me back. I mean, what I've done, I've ruined the town. I've ruined the whole economy. I've ruined him and his reputation. And by the way, the whole town was looking down on the father now for being crazy enough to do this. It didn't just disrupt the economy. Now the father's reputation is completely tarnished. He's a crazy old man. Son says, I'm going to go and ask him for a job. So all tattered and whatever he smelled like and looked like, he makes his way back around the Sea of Galilee to where this presumed town would be. And this is how it's supposed to go. He would walk in on the outskirts of town, and the children that are not working, not busy, that are playing, would see him and they would recognize him. And the children would start to surround him and sing a song. And the song would be something akin to, the fool is back in town. The fool is back in town. "Look, everybody, the fool is back in town." And they'd start singing this song and dancing around him and throwing dirt at him. And ha ha ha, the fool is back in town. And as they are making this ruckus, the older people start to look up and see what's going on, and they see the kid, and they join in the song, only they're not so gentle. They pick up rocks, and they're throwing little rocks at him, and they're singing, "The fool is back in town, the fool is back in town." And they would grab him by the scruff of the neck, and the townspeople now all gathered would bring him to the center of town, and the chief elder of the town would come and stand in front of the prodigal son. Somebody from the town would come and give the chief a big ceramic pot. Everywhere you go in the Middle East, everywhere you look down, there's little shards of pottery, ancient shards of pottery everywhere. They had a lot of it, I guess. And he would hold this pot above his head, and together, everybody in the town, led by the elder, would go, "Kazaza, kazaza, kazaza," they would yell, and then he'd smash the pot at the foot of the foolish young man. And they would say, "Get out of town, go get a job. When you have earned back the money that you borrowed from the father, plus interest, so that we can all be paid back, then you can come back into town." And they would have taken by the scruff of the neck. If he would have fought at all, he would have died. And they would have taken him out of town, kicked him in the hind end, and said, "Now go, find a job. When you can pay us back, you come back." That was what was supposed to happen. It's what would have happened. It's what did happen in towns like that Jesus was in. But Jesus tells a different story. Jesus says, while the kid was a long way off, before anybody sees him, the father catches the idea that he's coming back. He sees him. And the Bible paints this graphic picture of the father running to his son. I need to explain this to you so that you understand it really clearly. We think the father is running to the son when we first read this because it's his son and he can't wait to get to him. That's not why the father is running. The father, in order to run, has to reach down and grab his robe. They didn't have pants like we did. And he has to pull up his robe near his crotch, and he has to bare his legs. And as he's running, which is an incredibly undignified thing in that culture, old men don't run, they don't bare their legs. As he's running, all of the attention of the town is on him. And people would start to think, and then they would start to say out loud, "Look at the crazy old man. The old man is crazy. Look at how crazy he is." And he's running and smiling toward his son. The old man isn't running because he loves his son so much, and he does. The old man is running because he knows if he can get to his son first, he can save his son, hear me here, from the church. He can save his son from what he knows the church will do to him. Because Jesus isn't preaching, you folks, he isn't preaching to the town. He's preaching to the leaders of the church. He's preaching to the Pharisees. And he's running, and people are saying, "Look at the crazy old man, look at the crazy old man." Whatever reputation he had, it's gone now. And the Bible says he throws his arms around his son. He saved his son from the town. He saved his son from the church. And the Bible says in English that he kissed him. For those of you who were fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to take Greek, in Greek it says, and he kissed him, and he kissed him, and he kissed him, and he kissed him, and he kissed him. And he gives him a ring There's a good Adventist explanation for that, I'm sure. And he gives them sandals because only slaves wear bare feet. And he goes back to the house, and what's the order? I want you to go and kill the fatted soybean. We're going to have a huge party, right? And so those from the town who would show up, and everybody likes free food, as can be testified to here. For those who show up, the house is full. There's singing, and there's dancing, and there's soybean, and there's everything that everybody could want for a party. The oldest son is out in the field. And he hears a party. I wasn't invited to any party. Catch this. He goes down and he asks somebody, what's going on in there? Well, there's a party going on in there. Why? Your little brother came back. My little brother came back? Yeah, you're supposed to be in at the party. See, what's supposed to happen in that culture is, at a party like that, the older son would be standing behind the father against the wall, and he would be serving some of the dignitaries there, and then he would take his seat next to the father after he'd done some serving. That's what's supposed to happen. He's supposed to be in there. And he stands out there and he says, I'm not going in there. And so a servant goes into the house and says to the father, hey, your oldest son's out there, but he won't come in. The second time, the father plays the fool to save a son. In that culture, the father should get very irate, and he should send some servants out, go take him, bind him up, throw him in a closet, I'll punish him later. But instead, again, the father stands up and he walks out to the son. Again, his reputation just gets shattered by this. And he tries to reason with the son. And what does he say? Basically, he says, you didn't have to ask for a goat. Everything I have is yours. Everything I've always had has always been yours. Why are you so jealous? He says, now come into the banquet. And this is the most awkward ending of any parable that Jesus tells, because it doesn't end. We don't know what the older son does. The parable ends with them standing outside of the house. Now, Jesus intensifies this, and the Pharisees know the older son is the church. And the church is looking in at a bunch of stuff that it completely disapproves of, and it's having to weigh, do I want to go in there and be associated with those kind of people or not? I don't know. Let me ask you. Who's not welcome at your table? In your church, who's not welcome at your table? I interviewed at a church, and I'm not making any kind of a statement here, but I want you to get the gist of what's going on here. I interviewed at a church, and they asked me a question. It was just a hot button in their church at the time, I guess, and they said, what's your stance on gay people? I said, my stance on gay people? Yeah, what's your stance on gay people? Furrowed brow, some guy around the table asking me this. I said, do I have to have a stance on them? And they said, yeah. I said, well, what do you think? And some pretty harsh words spoken. And I said, here's my deal. I told him. I said, I want everybody, if I'm the pastor of this church, I want everybody that we can possibly get in these pews hearing stories about Jesus. Everybody. No questions asked. I want them here. Well, I don't know that that's... I said, okay, if I take this call, I'm going to set you outside the door before people come in, and you ask them if they're gay or straight. And if they're gay, I want the words out of your mouth to be, Jesus doesn't want you in this church. And he said, well, I'm not saying that. I said, kind of sounds like you are. A little bit. Maybe more than a little bit. And I got emotional about it because that was just one issue with one segment of the society that a lot of people think shouldn't be allowed or shouldn't belong. There's a whole list of people that we've created, right? And we've done a good job of it. I mean, it starts with we're the right church and everybody else is the wrong church. In our history, they were all Babylon and we were all ready for ascension. And then it just kind of went downhill from there. So my Thanksgiving table, 3 years ago, Thanksgiving in November. I was sitting at the head of the table, and next to me was my dad, who lives with us. He's lived with us for the last 12 years. He's got emphysema because he smoked for 50 years, and my dad has never been a believer. He says, I'm not a joiner, I don't do that kind of thing. And okay, Dad, love you anyway. Sitting right next to him was my wife, who is a believer. Sitting next to her is my son, who we adopted from a young couple in British Columbia that after preaching at a camp meeting, they realized we didn't have kids and they got pregnant. They were 18 and 16, and she found out 4 months into it, and I guess there was some legal issues about having an abortion. So they called us and said, would you like a kid? And we went, sure. So we adopted him. Sitting next to him were his birth parents, who ended up getting married, never had kids after that, and when he was 14, contacted us and said, can we meet him? And we left it up to our son, and they said, sure. So they were going to come over for an hour, and they ended up staying at our house for 3 days. And now we have a relationship with them. So they were sitting next to them were my birth parents, the mom that I told you about and her husband that they met on the blind date at the bar, and both of them atheists. Sitting next to them was my nephew. His name's Taylor, and my nephew Taylor is a heroin addict. He has to have heroin, and he's been in and out of rehabs and everything. He just can't quit having heroin. Sitting next to him was my sister, adopted from the other family and growing up. Sitting next to my sister was my wife's brother and his husband. There, my son has grown up with Uncle Kent and Uncle Josen. And then around the rest of the table were a whole bunch of strays from my community that nobody wanted over at their house, and they didn't have anybody to eat Thanksgiving with, and they were just sitting around my table. And we all held hands and had a blessing over the food. And my wife and I told every one of them, there's always room at our table for you. You're always welcome here. Other parts of society might say, or some of your families have said, you're not welcome, but here, you're always welcome. I sincerely believe that the church better come around to figuring out that was Jesus' message. He never ate with the right people. He always hung out with and ate with the wrong people. And we keep preaching to each other and evangelizing each other when there's a whole sick world out there that needs to know that they're chosen and that they're included and they're welcome at the table of Jesus. They're just welcome. No strings attached. We're not going to make you take a test. Just come and sit and be in the presence of Jesus. Our church is getting more and more polarized. Right and left and whatever. Pro this, against this. And as we do that as a church, pastors, as we do that as a church, we're standing outside of the banquet table. And we're arguing with the master about going in. And I'm telling you, if we don't figure it out, they're going to go out into the highways, the byways, and he's going to invite everybody in, the righteous and the wicked, Matthew says. Anybody that'll come in and just sit with Jesus and have a meal. Some of you might feel like, man, I'm the dude that doesn't get to go into the banquet because nobody wants me there. You're wanted there. Some of you might feel like, well, there are some people that I don't think should be, and they're a bad influence on our kids. Well, probably so are you, to some degree. Man, we better open our church doors. We better open them wide. We better let every single person know that they're a child of God, that they're chosen, they're predestined for greatness, and give them that invitation. I had a young couple going to children's Sabbath school in my church. And both of them male with a little girl. I'm not advocating for anything. I think that there's things that are probably right and wrong and all that. And they come in and sit in church, come up for children's story, and had somebody come up to me and say, I don't think it's right. I said, well, what don't you think is right? I don't think it's right that they're in Sabbath school together with their child. I don't think it's right that they're in church with their child, that they come up for children's church. I don't think it's right. Who's going to tell them about Jesus? If they're not here, where are they going to go? Pastor, you're right. Next Sabbath, they invited them to their home for Sabbath lunch after church. I don't think we should be the young fool that spent all the money, and when the older brother accused him of spending it all on porneia. And I don't think we should be the older brother standing outside. If we are either of those things, God will make a fool of himself to come and rescue us and bring us back in. He will. He's that kind of God. I think we should be the people sitting at the table with Jesus, feasting and singing and dancing and celebrating his love. This is all about imitating God, right? If you want to imitate God, have everybody at your table.